Greetings. We're so glad you're here because it's a cold night and it's winter, and this is a wonderful way to warm up your hearts and your minds. So this evening, we wanted to welcome you to the Westborough Historical Society that was founded in 1889. And its home is here in Slaymaker William Sibley's home that was built in 1844. So it's a wonderful antique home, the only brick one on Parkman Street and right downtown, which is a great location for us. Our mission, we are a nonprofit, and as I said, it started in 1889, and our mission is to share and preserve the history of Westborough and to benefit the public in sharing this history so they will know more about how wonderful our town is. And one of the ways we do that is to maintain a collection of artifacts that date from 6,000 before present, 6,000 years ago, right through the present. And the room for the present is right there. And we welcome you to give us special artifacts that were used in Westborough that tell the story of its history. And we think that we have open houses for all of you to come visit. At least twice a year, we give private open houses to clubs. And the other way we share our history is by giving programs once a month. And our calendar for the rest of the spring will be on Saturday, April 5th. There's going to be a special community read of Johnny Tremaine, and our Sue Lippett is running that, and she'll tell you about that. Then on May 5th, we will have a special concert at the Willows, the musical history of Westborough, and we're lucky to have Marcia Hoffman, who is one of the singers. There? As telling the story of Westborough in song. On Sunday, March 18th, is an open house. It's part of Westborough Unplugs Week, and we think a great way to engage children and their parents and anyone who would like to come in their shared history is to come to an open house. And finally, on June 7th, we have a spring bazaar, which is a great lot of fun because people bring us all kinds of interesting things that we can sell very cheaply and help us preserve the history. So we have this calendar that you're welcome to pick up, and perhaps you can put it right out in the hall.
Sure.
And this evening, the program is about Johnny Tremaine, and Sue Lippett and Leslie and I prepared it. And Sue's going to tell a little bit of how this is woven together in our special celebration of the Revolution and the 250th anniversary.
Hi all, thanks for coming tonight. When we were brainstorming about how do we celebrate the 250th, what does Westborough do for that? And I was doing some research and discovered that this is the 80th anniversary of Esther Forbes winning the Newbery Award, which is an award for excellence in youth literature. So I'm a big fan of Moby Dick. And they do a readathon of Moby Dick every year, so I thought, well, why shouldn't we do a readathon of Esther Forbes' book, Johnny Tremaine? So this is our maiden voyage and our kickoff event to celebrating our country's birthday, special birthday, and it's Saturday, April 5th at the Town Hall. It's going to be telecast live. It's going to start at 9. Reading slots are available for every 15 minutes, so we hope any and all of you will sign up for a slot, come into the Town Hall, and read for 15 minutes and help participate in moving this story back into Westborough. Many people our age, my age, have read it, but a lot of younger people have not. It's going to be telecast live, there are going to be chairs, so if people want to sit and watch, they can, but they can also watch at home. So if you think you'd like to have a reading slot, please come see me and I will get your email and send you a link, and you can sign up on a Sign Up Genius. And bring your water bottle and your best speaking voice, and we will provide a place to stand and the book, and you will be all set. So we hope you'll participate. It's a novel idea. I know it's a little different, but I think it's kind of a fun idea, and we're asking high school students to join us as well. And so we want a broad brush of the community to come in and help us celebrate this. And so in order to really get the community thinking about who is Esther Forbes, because we all know the Forbes name, but maybe not her specifically, Leslie and others said, we should do a program. So we said, great, Leslie, go. So that is why we are doing this program tonight, to sort of introduce you to her, and I've learned a lot about her in the process of being a part of putting this together, and she is a very intriguing character and a wonderful story to have come from our small town. So with that, I'm going to introduce Leslie, and she'll take it from here.
Why don't you guys slide over a little bit so you can see Nancy? Okay. I don't think you're going to block your phone. Okay. Welcome, everyone. I'm Leslie. I'm a member here at the Society. I have been for 25 years. This is like one of my favorites, along with Garden Club. So one of the wonderful things about, I think, our Society is it allows people who want to step up and explore something, learn about something, just do it. So I'm an amateur historian, and I had a lot of help from our town, one of our town historians, and a great editor. So this is a conglomeration, and we're going to tell the story of Esther Forbes and the world that she lived in. And the reason why we're starting here is she was born in Westborough, so part of her world was Westborough. So she's part of Westborough history. I used the cover of her Pulitzer Prize winning, the frontispiece, I guess it's called, of her book, Paul Revere and the World That He Lived In, because it had a map. And as you can see, I'm a map nut. So, but it also kind of shows how small Boston was, and how limited Paul Revere's world was. And I think as we start to learn about Esther, we'll see what influences she had, but she always stuck to her roots in all of her writing. And that's what I learned about her. So let's get going. So I start off with a map. Gee, I wonder why. So Esther was born in Westborough in June of 1891. She was born in this home here that's still on Church Street. It's 39 Church Street. And as you can see from this map from the 1890s, this is the center of town. There were no cars yet, so we didn't have a rotary, but we did have an intersection because the train came through town. I think that's the Horse Trough Fountain, but I'm not sure. This map is one of the pictorial maps of the time. So somebody walked around and figured out what all the houses looked like and drew this kind of a freehand map. You can see here's the church and Church Street, and this is the house that's on that corner right there. Okay, so she lived in right near the downtown, and we think of like the 1800s. Westborough was booming. Look at the factories here, all downtown. We were the largest maker of straw hats in the 1890s. We had bicycle factories and other kind of underwear factories, and we were an industrial type of mix of residential and industry in our community, and that's the community that she was born into. And this was the home of her parents. I want to learn a little bit more about her family. A lot of people know the Forbes name in town because we have several buildings that are named Forbes Municipal Building, the Forbes Community Center. Kirkside was donated by the Forbes to the community. The people who had the money at the time, and finally pointer, was Frank and Fanny Forbes. Okay, so I'll show you the connection to Esther. The other thing, I think, who does genealogy work? Anybody look up stuff? I do, and it's confusing sometimes. How would you like to follow this family? Jonathan, 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 Jonathan. It's tough, and it's interesting, like how they named, you know, after this son and went down. So it's difficult to follow some genealogy. We're also looking at two different names here, the Forbish name and the Forbes name. And the only thing I can think of, there's a wonderful Forbes kind of genealogy book that they talk about the Scottish name Forbes was pronounced with two syllables. And so it might have come out sounding like Forbish, Forbish. And so that's where the Forbish maybe spelling came from, and then they changed it back to actually the way it was spelled. There was a sound pronunciation of the last name and then the real name. So you'll see that her family name, Forbes, switched from Forbish to Forbes in that generation. What was interesting is all of the Jonathan Forbes were deacons of the Congregational Church. So if you talk about Deacon Jonathan Forbes, you're referring to all of them. It's just really fun. So we go down the family tree. I don't have all of the siblings here, just the parents here. And Esther Forbes' grandparents were Ephraim Trowbridge Forbes and Catherine White. These all living in Westborough. Her uncle, William, her father, and Frank Forbes was her uncle. So you can see that they were 2 years apart. I think there were 6 siblings in there. So that's the genealogy of the Forbes family in Westborough. These are Esther's parents, Harriet Merrifield Forbes and William Trowbridge Forbes. Harriet was always really special to me because she was an early pioneer of gravestone art and published a book on the gravestones and the early American Puritan gravestones and the men who carved them. And she really started that genre of appreciating the carvings on our gravestones. And the cemetery across from Town Hall has the oldest carvings of gravestones in our community, and they're beautiful. So next spring project on a beautiful day, take some time and walk around that cemetery. We take the kids from the 3rd grade there because it's just a beautiful place. She was a historian, she was an author, a photographer, early photographer. This is like, early turn of the century. Her husband, William, was a teacher, a lawyer, a judge. He, was sounded like a brilliant man. And they had 5 children who lived, 6 children total. Esther was the youngest of all of the siblings, and there they are on horseback. I love some of these old photos. So she was born here, lived on Church Street, started to be raised here, but her family did move to Worcester. And the driving force was that Esther's maternal grandfather died and left them some property in Worcester. And I have another map so you can see where they did. And so when Esther was 7 years old, the family moved. And you have to realize, even though he started being an attorney here in Westborough, he got a judgeship in Worcester. So he was commuting to Worcester. So the fact that all of a sudden they had land and a home to move to, they decided to move to Worcester. The interesting part here is that this was the land that was part of the family, through the will, that they inherited all of that land. I don't think they had a lot of money at this time. And so what they did is that they built a brand new house, and they divided this up. So if you look here now on maps in Worcester, these are all streets here. I think there are 3 streets, one of which was newly laid out called Trowbridge Road. And they had a house on Trowbridge Road. And they, I think, sold the rest of the lots. So that allowed them to have some money. If you look, this is where WPI is. And so the street's still there. They built a brand new house because they now had a little bit of money. He was a judge. He wanted to impress people. A beautiful home. It was in the English half timber Tudor style. And it was survived until 2003, and then it was demolished, which is kind of a shame. We still have her family home here in Westborough. So they were now living in Worcester. So Esther had 4 older siblings, 2 brothers, 2 sisters. From all the readings that I have, they must have been pretty brilliant. The older brothers went to Amherst, the girls went to Vassar. They were all college educated, which was kind of unusual at the time. Esther had started school in Westborough, but really she was not a great student. And you hear, you read that she had terrible eyesight and was quite distracted. She had trouble in school. And she ultimately attended the new Bancroft School, which is now still existing, but these are pictures of Bancroft School in that early 1900s, at the time that Esther would have been in school. So not only was she having problems in school, she then got rheumatic fever, and she had to be out of school for a long time. So her mother ended up being her teacher, and her mother enjoyed, I think, spending time with her youngest child at home and sharing all of her passions, one of which was history and one of which was art. So Esther really got a great education, homeschool. I think it probably fit her learning style a little bit better, and she started to thrive and be part of this family, and I think her key gift was storytelling. So her mother encouraged her to read, draw, and she really kind of embedded in her this early love of history. So you'll see in these PowerPoint slides, you see italics. Those are actually quotes from Esther that I have pulled out from different places. So her family was interested in history. They loved to tell stories, and Esther became a storyteller. Her family had deep roots through her grandmother. Catherine Wright was related to Sam Adams, so there was a lot of New England history in the family, a lot of pride around their role in establishing communities here in New England and in Massachusetts. And she said, I was brought up on the stories of early New England. And she said, I was steeped in the region's folklore as a pickle in brine. So, I mean, she was, really seeing this indoctrination as part of her upbringing. Her mother also had a great interest in art, and they live right near the Worcester Art Museum. And so there's tales of them going to visit the art museum. So it was just, a really great way to take a student who wasn't interested in classroom learning outside. She was always making up stories, and it said at about the age of 10, she was working on 4 different novels. None of those were published, but she was writing down her stories, and her family encouraged all of that. After Bancroft, she took some classes at the Worcester Art Museum, and she ultimately enrolled in Bradford College, which was a junior college up in Haverhill. There's a wonderful story of her and a classmate walking to Lawrence to watch the strikes in Lawrence and to see history happening, real, live, and in person. But she was always skipping classes and breaking school rules because she was just so really crazy to write. And it's interesting, the quotes that come back is that she just was so passionate about writing, but not so much about learning. But she did graduate from Bradford College at the age of 21. And that's a picture of Bradford at the time. I love some of these old postcards because they capture what the world looked like back then. So in 1915, her sister Catherine actually got a job at the University of Wisconsin as a teacher, and so she traveled with her. She had shared a room with Catherine as she was growing up. They were close sisters. And Esther was living with her on the campus and started to take some classes as a special student, but she never really enrolled at the university. So here's her world is expanding a little bit outside of Massachusetts. Now she's living in Wisconsin. At this time, World War I broke out, and there was a lot of what can you do for the war effort? And she went to West Virginia to work on a farm. She was great with animals and horses, and she ended up moving a horse-drawn cart through the orchards for them gathering apples. She loved it, she had a great time, I think she really liked being outside, and she returned there for 3 summers. And she talked about it as the proudest years of her life. I don't have an exact quote, but that's from one of her memoirs. So while she's at Wisconsin, she was continuing writing stories. So she wrote a story called Breakneck Hill. It was set in the fictional town of Westborough, we know where that is. And it was ultimately published in a college review. It then went on to win the O. Henry Prize for short stories. And this is the first really published work of Esther. And what does she do? She gets a major award. So that was in 1920. So now at the age of 27, she comes back to Massachusetts and she gets a job at Houghton Mifflin. I'm probably pronouncing that wrong, but it's the publishing company. And they originally hired her to like type letters and to do some kind of clerical work, and she was terrible at it. Her spelling was atrocious. I really think she might have been dyslexic or, ADHD. I'm not sure. She seemed really distracted in some of the rote kind of administrative work, but she was good at reading manuscripts because those were stories, and she loved stories. She started reading manuscripts. She made a lot of great recommendations to the editors. They really caught on with her, and so she worked at that company for the next 6 years. She was continuing writing at the time, and guess who decided to publish her first real novel? Was her publishing company, her employer. And it was called O Genteel Lady. It was a story of a young New England woman. She's writing about New England, who was hemmed in by social conventions. Think of the times at that point, early 1900s. When did women get the vote here in Massachusetts? 1930, right?
No, 20.
1919.
1920.
1919? Oh, okay. But it's around that time. So here's a story. What happened was, it was chosen by the Book of the Month Club, which meant instantly she would sell a lot of volumes of this book. So here she is now selling 13,500 copies for her first book. It became a bestseller. She stopped working at Houghton Mifflin because now she can make money writing. And so there is a picture of her in 1926 on the front piece of her book, her first published book. So also in 1926, she was living in Cambridge. She met a young attorney. He was a Harvard Law School student, Albert Hoskins. He was handsome. He was a brilliant lawyer. I'm sure her family agreed because her father was an attorney. And so they got married. They took that standard European tour. Her world opened up a little bit. She got to see a little bit more of what's there. But what do? They come back here, and he gets a job in New York City. So they moved to New York City. At this time, Esther was working on a book, and she suffered a miscarriage. It, I think, was a little depressive period for her. She kind of threw out the version of the book that she had, started it all over again. She really, seemed to be a writer that was, working hard at the writing process. And in 1928, she published a book called A Mirror for Witches. And this was about a witch hunt from the Salem witch trials and that history of Massachusetts and America that she was finding with all of her, family was involved in also. And I love this, that as a child, she recalls that she was mad about witches, so much so that her mother stitched little red devils onto her handkerchiefs, which I thought would be really fun as a young girl pulling out, or a young woman pulling out a handkerchief and having witches. So this was another book that talked to and spoke to New England and Massachusetts history. So they were living in New York. Albert now takes a position as a probation officer in Boston. The couple moved back to Weston, and Esther was working on a very long novel, the novel called Paradise. It was a historical romance set where? In Massachusetts Bay Colony. She kept returning to that world of history and Massachusetts history. It wasn't published till later, till 1937. But at the time, this is a very long book, and she was working a lot on it, and I think her husband was jealous. Not only the fact that she was a published author, but she was spending a lot of time doing that. And he actually forbade her to work on the book when he was at home. So she would write furiously when he went to work, and then, be a wife in the evening, and kind of hid her writing. The Great Depression hits, and it hits this family hard. It hit a lot of families hard. There was a lot of struggle, and I think the marriage wasn't doing well. So in 1933, the couple divorced. What was interesting that we all know her as Esther Forbes, but she kept Albert's last name, Hoskins, as her legal name. She only wrote under the name Esther Forbes. So here she is, all alone, and she really didn't want to live all alone in the Boston area. She goes back to her family. At this point, her father had recently died. Her mother was living alone in Worcester, and she moved back. She had a great relationship with her mother. They both, I think, fed off their interests around history and writing, and so she went to live. And I think it was a very nice arrangement, not only for Esther, but for her mother. Harriet's book in 1927 had established that appreciation of gravestone art, so she was a published author. Guess who published that book? Open Mifflin. And so Harriet's also working with her daughter as part of that research work that they were doing. And then Esther used the money that she was making in publishing to help support her mother. So I think that was a great relationship, and it worked well for Esther. So this was a book her next book that came out, and she called it, she did it in Harriet, and she called it Chintzy. And all I could think of is they needed money. Why would she put out a book that she maybe wasn't so proud of and publish it, but it probably brought in some revenue. So once again, it's about a young girl in a New England village. So here we are, we see that theme reoccurring with Esther's work of young women in New England and, fulfilling their path, their dreams, their, being involved and pushing maybe societal norms. Her next book, published a couple years later, The General's Lady, was about a woman who hired two men to kill her patriot husband. That woman is modeled after a true story, Bathsheba Spooner, who was the first woman to be hung for her deadly deed in Worcester. So that was another novel about a woman in these times, these colonial times. So at around the late 1930s, war starting to loom in Europe. Esther was working on a project about somebody who was involved in conflict from a neutral position. And it wasn't until the World War II broke out that she realized neutrality wasn't as exciting as revolution and war and patriotism. So she chose to write a biography about Paul Revere. I think there was some confluences of interest here, though, when you think her mother had done a lot of research in this area, historical research, and also her publisher, Houghton Mifflin, had access to the family's Revere papers. So she had kind of an insider's kind of leg up on some of this material. So she used her mother's years of research, these papers through her publisher, and she writes a book, her first more of a biography, historical biography, called Paul Revere and the World He Lived in. This was the front piece, the cover of the book, and you noticed it featured an artist's portrait, Copley's portrait of Paul Revere. It's the only portrait that Copley did of an individual who wasn't in dressed up clothes. If you look at, we have a couple of portraits around here, people usually dressed in their best dress for a portrait. It was kind of something that they did. And here we see Paul Revere in shirt sleeves in his silversmith shop. So it's an important portrait that way. I wonder if Esther saw that in one of the museums, in one of her travels around Massachusetts. This book For this book, she received the Pulitzer Prize. And at that time, it came with a cash award of $500. It was only the second time a woman had won a Pulitzer Prize. Someone said, well, why wasn't she, it didn't win for biography, and I forget who the person was for biography. That year there were a lot of very famous people who won Pulitzers. Robert Frost won a Pulitzer for his poetry. So this is kind of the world that she's in, is now, this really astute author category, winning a Pulitzer Prize at this age. And so in 1943, she was interviewed by the Worcester Telegram, and she wrote, "There have been many books about the intellectual leaders of that time, but none about the artisan." This is where she was steeped in those stories of the common man, the men who work with hands all their lives. Paul Revere, who went to work with, he was 13, represented the average man. And that's the story she wanted to tell. She wanted to tell the story of this individual and his role in the revolution. Who's read that book? Anybody? Oh, it's fascinating. Gotta read it. This is gonna spur your next reading. I'm gonna watch the library book orders come in. So now she's done all this research on Paul Revere and what it meant to be a silversmith and what it was like in colonial times and what was going on. And there was a lot of tension even within Boston between people who were loyal to the crown and people who were revolutionaries. They were living together. Boston becomes occupied. It's a great time in history. But what trickles out from her is the role of the apprentices, that she never realized the vital role that they played in all of the tradesmen's work. So she wrote a novel. It was more geared to young adults, not so much children, but that middle age. And it was the story of Johnny Tremaine, who was a young apprentice to a Boston silversmith. Gee, I wonder who that Boston silversmith would have been modeled on. So book comes out, and what happens? She wins another award. She wins the Newbery Award, which is more around children's literature, young literature. It won that award in 1944. It was picked up by Disney and made into a Disney movie in 1957. And now it's still required in many schools. I read it as a child, even in New Jersey. We weren't from Massachusetts. We read some of these classic stories that were history, that way to learn history through a good story. And so that's why I really encourage you to come to the readathon, because it's such a great story and it's written so well. The book remains in print, it's been translated into multiple languages, and it's one of those classic stories that really never ages because it's telling the story of our past through the eyes of a young boy. So she actually began writing it on December 8th, 1941, the day after Pearl Harbor. So here she is again, inspired by historical things happening and that catalyst and that change and what's going on in our world. She was impressed with the way young men in our country were all of a sudden scooped up and taken to war and had to become adults at a very young age. And so getting all those responsibilities, and that, if you read Johnny Tremaine, that's embedded into the story, that sense of like, well, I have to grow up fast. Here's the New York Times saying, Miss Forbes' juvenile story, Johnny Tremaine, which tells the story of a silversmith's apprentice who hobnobbed with famous revolutionary figures. It won the Newbery Award as one of the most prestigious given for a children's book. Another reviewer said Johnny Tremaine could join those immortals of boys' fictions, Jim Hawkins and Huck Finn. And then Esther Forbes herself on her book said, we give all we have, lives, property, safety, skill. We fight, we die for a simple thing, only that a man can stand up. So she's taking what's happening in her world and bringing it forward to children in a story fashion. Really, I think that's why I think it's so timeless. She was a dear friend to not only Worcester, but in Massachusetts. She was, that consummate person who sat on boards, gave money, contributed to the wealth of her community. For those of you who know, the Worcester Historical Museum owns the Salisbury Mansion that's right near the old courthouse there. That was moved up the hill and preserved. She was part of that work to make sure that it stayed a historic museum. She received an honorary doctorate of letters from Clark University. I know she did some lecturing there. She was a trustee of the library and a member of the board of directors of the library. She was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 1949 and the first woman elected to the American Antiquarian Society. If you haven't been to the Antiquarian Society, they are still in existence in Worcester, right up the hill from where she lived. They collect paper from the time of publication in America up until the establishment of the Library of Congress. So they have lots of old newspapers and pamphlets and flyers and other things, letters. The Parkman diaries from Westborough are there because they're available for scholars doing historic research. Esther's mother, Harriet, did a lot of research at the Antiquarian Society, and so did Harriet. They saw that as a community resource, but she also was involved in making sure that it was viable and carried on. Her writing mythology, and I talked a little bit about her struggles as a young girl in school. She didn't write, I think, the perfect sentence the first time. So she writes quickly, and she's not too critical as she writes. So she did like that brain dump. She got it down on paper, and then was probably an editor. She got caught up, captured her imagination, and put it down. She said, it either finally crops up in the book or ends up in the wastebasket. So she was understanding. This is a time when she wrote in pencil, before computers, folks. Remember those days? Okay. And she says, this gives me something to base it on and find myself. Most of my planning comes after I've done a great deal of the book. All of a sudden she goes, oh, maybe I should rearrange this and put this there. She goes, I don't know anybody else who does it this way. It just worked for her. Rainbow on the Road was one of the last books she wrote. She goes, over 5 years, I rewrote it 5 times. And that's dedication to craft. I think I would have thrown it out the window. The first draft sounded as they boned up on Thoreau. Too much nature. Then, when it came upon the idea of the narrator after the 3rd year, things went better. I throw away an awful lot. And then she also said in a New York Herald book review in 1954, the present is exciting, but it confuses me. I'm like a painter who needs a frame to know where to stop. So now I'm thinking, all that art museum thing, she just liked the past. It was comfortable to her. She could research it. She had some sense of control. It just worked for her. But as a writer, she was definitely first draft, second draft, third draft. Writing a book for 5 years is a pretty dedicated writer. So during World War II, Newton Mifflin asked her to come back to work. You have to remember, a lot of men are going out into the war effort, and women kind of filled in places in business and industry. And so now she's living in Worcester and has to come into Boston. So she took the train. And I know Sue asked me to find out what the train toll was, and I haven't been able to, but you guys can find out and let us know. So we need those schedules of the trains in 1940s. You know, how long did it take, and what did it cost? It probably was faster than today, who knows? So as she's working in Newton Mifflin, I think she's also continuing to write. She was a really dedicated writer. In 1948, now what does she do? She writes another book, The Running of the Tide, and she wins another prize. This woman, every time she pushes out a novel, other than the chintzy one that she had to get money for, wins a literary type of prize. So the Metro Golden Mayor Award at the time brought a prize of $150,000. A little bit higher than that $500 she won for the Pulitzer. And so at the time she goes, I'm going to have fresh cut white flowers in my house all the time, even in winter. So now I think she's starting to splurge a little bit on herself and, you know, taking the money and just indulging herself. In 1954, you can see like 6 years later, she publishes Rainbow in the Road, and that became a literary guild selection. In other words, a choice book for people to read. And then several years later, it was made into a musical, and Agnes DeMille did the choreography and staging, so that carried out in musical form. So her writing was not only popular, won awards, but it also transcended into a film we saw with Disney, and now into a stage production. So it's coming alive in different, modalities. So Esther died in August of 1967. She's buried in Pine Grove Cemetery, which is the cemetery off 135. We have several cemeteries. We have Memorial, Midland, Pine Grove, and then St. Luke's. Pine Grove has a mix of a couple of gravestones from early days that were maybe moved there, the graves creating family plots, but the Forbes have a full family plot there. And so she's born in Westborough and she returns to Westborough. All of her papers, now she's a single person, and her family had, money. She didn't even give it to Frank and Fanny, but she donated things. So she donated her papers and her manuscripts to Clark University. Her royalties from all of her work were donated to the American Antiquarian Society. So when Sue wanted to do this project with Johnny Tremaine, you had to talk to the Antiquarian Society because they have the rights to that name still, and still get revenue because that book is still being published. And she also left $10,000 to her favorite art museum, the Worcester Art Museum. So she gave back even in her legacy of contributing to her community. And at the time, there's a great New York Times obituary, which I suggest you read. Everything's online. New York Times has a great archive of articles from in the past. The Times described her as a novelist who wrote like a historian, and a historian who wrote like a novelist. And I thought that just sums her up so perfectly. The mix of her world of history and stories came together, and what a legacy to leave all of these wonderful stories. But really a truly fascinating woman who, lived a very interesting life. She made it, work for her, even though her marriage didn't work, she didn't have children. She had a strong supportive family, but I think she escaped in her stories. There's some of the resources I used. This is a great genealogy that's online. It's really fun to read. So you just start reading, and they have an annotated things of stories about the family within this kind of just a genealogical kind of description of the Forbes family. I found some really great stuff there. The Times has an interview with her. This was interesting in a historical journal of her Rainbow on the Road, and it's a story that has, it's about an artist. So here's the art again in her life, in her stories. That's a great thing. I think Chris shared me Margaret Erskine's Esther Forbes, the Worcester Bicentennial Commission had put together a story, and they had captured in this little booklet a lot of those early photographs, which I think were from the family. So I was able to capture, her brothers and her on a horse, and her as a young girl. So I think that's the other part I would encourage you all is to dig a little. You'll be surprised what you can find online, where you talk to Chris Allen and she just hands it to you. But I learned a lot, and I learned a little bit about what to find out there, and I realized that some of the articles that were online had captured her own words. So I thought that was a great way to tell her story with her own words. Not only her novel's words, but her quotes in articles, which I like. So here's that Johnny Tremaine readathon. I've signed up. Okay, it's something you maybe have never done. Let's try it. And I think it'll be really interesting to hear all the voices of our community reading a story, because Westborough was part part of that whole revolutionary time period. You know, we are a community that sent militiamen to fight in the early battles. We had the war effort going on, the support of that, and so celebrating the 1776 250th anniversary next year in 2026 is a really kind of exciting time, but I think you have to go back a little bit. So go back in this story and read it with us, and I think you'll get that excitement about history and what I know they're doing the Battle of Lexington and Concord on Patriots Day. They do every year, but this is that, they did that in 1775. So this is the 250th anniversary of that. And if you go, you have to be there before, say, 5:30 in the morning. It's very cold, it always rains, and bring a small ladder because there's 10,000 people. Coming to this is going to be a whole lot nicer. So here are those dates that Chris talked about. We have a website, and I put the information about the programs on that. But the best way to follow us as we run around the town is through Facebook. If you're on Facebook, just like us, and you'll get notice of the programs. I think that's it. Yes.